Our speaker this evening is Dr. Stephanie Azzarello, who is Leverhulme postdoctoral fellow at the Kunsthistorisches Institute here in Florence. Her talk will explore the dark side of the Renaissance, and so it is most suitably entitled A Beautiful Darkness. Rivalry, competition and madness in Renaissance Florence. May I ask you please to welcome Dr. Stephanie Azzarello.
Great. Can everyone hear me? Okay, good. This is the first time with this technology, especially post-pandemic. So thank you, Mark, for that introduction. That was very kind. And I want to thank the British Institute for having me here and Simon Gamel for being excited and supportive. I'm okay. Sorry, I'm not sure how to. Yes, maybe I'll do that instead and sort of then.
Yeah.
Yes, the handheld one is probably easier.
Yeah.
So is this better? Can everyone? Okay, great. Now we're cooking with gas. Okay, so let's rewind. Thank you, Mark, for the introduction and for the assistance with the microphone. And I want to thank the British Institute for having me tonight, and Simon Gamel, who was really excited and supportive of this idea that I suggested about looking at the less rosy side of the Renaissance. And I also want to thank Lucia and Solidaire for being very supportive when I first arrived and helping me set up. So without further ado, I think we'll just get on with getting on. So imagine a typical evening in an Italian restaurant. Patrons chatting and laughing, the clamoring of glasses and cutlery, waiters bustling around carrying plates of aromatic creamy pasta. All of a sudden you hear a loud shout and a crash. You turn to see what the source of the chaos is. A waiter is lying on the floor with a broken plate smashed over his head, shards of pottery and strings of spaghetti scattered everywhere. The culprit, Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio, the famous and infamous monotonous Caravaggio. The reason for this aggression, the waiter simply questioned Caravaggio's taste in food. This true account is but one of many types of violent outbursts that were associated with Caravaggio during his brilliant but troubled life and career. This opening anecdote sets the stage nicely for my talk tonight, which will focus on a side of the Renaissance that might surprise many people. When you hear the word Renaissance or Renaissance, tomato, tomato, it is easy for images of the Sistine Chapel, the Duomo, and the birth of Venus to instantly spring to mind. Most people think of the Renaissance as a period of incredible creativity, enlightened thought, and a return to the ideas and values of classical antiquity. And while it absolutely was, the Renaissance was also a time of rivalry, competition, and envy among artists, many of whom were vying for commissions, patrons, and fame. In this evening's talk, I want to explore this side of the Renaissance by looking at some of the most well-known artists and works, but not with the aim of further glorifying them or extolling their historical and cultural virtues to you. Instead, I would like us to take a walk on the wild side by probing the intellectual and creative underbelly of the Renaissance, of Renaissance painting and sculpture, And my intention is for you to see the rich artistic tapestry of Quattrocento Florence through slightly less rose-tinted glasses. We will begin by discussing the dynamic between artistic output and the nature of competition. Next, we will investigate competition and rivalry by examining its active agents of envy and slander. We will then conclude with a discussion of competition and rivalry vis-a-vis the Paragone, which was the famous intellectual debate pitting sculpture against painting. If we want to have a discussion about the true nature of competition and rivalry in Renaissance Italy, then there is no better place to start than Or San Michele here in Florence. Translating into English as the kitchen garden of St. Michael, this church was built on a place where there was originally a monastery of San Michele. And on that very location was where the garden stood, the products of which were used in the monastery's kitchen, hence the name. The monastery no longer exists, but the building that you see, which came to replace it, can be seen by anybody walking along the Via Calzuoli. In 1337, Francesco Talenti, Neri di Fioravante, and Benci di Cione built the structure to act as the grain market. Then, sometime between 1380 and 1404, it was converted into a church. From that point, it was then being used by Florence's craft and trades guilds, which were a powerful political and economic force in the city. This massive, square-shaped, three-story building would become the site of some of the most overt and active artistic competition in Florence during the Quattrocento, with the guilds each trying to outdo one another. Before I get into the details of how this competition played out over nearly the entire century, let me first give you some context for who and what the guilds were. In many ways, the closest modern equivalent to the Renaissance guilds would be unions. Loosely defined, a guild is a group or an association of artisans, craftsmen, and/or merchants that oversaw the practices and trade of their respective activity. They are not unique to Florence and have a long tradition in many European countries, including the Netherlands and France. Because places like Florence and Venice were hubs of international trade and commerce, it makes economic and political sense that they would also have an active guild network. In Florence, the guilds were secular, but were usually associated with a patron saint, about which I will say more shortly. The guilds of Florence are called the Arti, which were divided into three groups. You had the Arti Maggiore, the 7 major guilds, the Arti Medianti, the 5 middle guilds, and the Arti Minore, the 9 minor guilds. The guilds were formed out of medieval economic institutions that ensured quality control over production and industry of particular goods, crafts, and services. And they also played a large role in the development of the commune. There was also a gendered aspect to the guilds in that in order to become a member, you had to be the son of a male member in good standing. And the entrance protocol for the guilds was very strict and highly structured, which we know from the meticulous records that each guild kept. The first guild to be mentioned in archival documentation is the Cloth Merchants Guild. But not all of the guilds in Florence were equal in power, wealth, and prestige, with the Arti Maggiori being at the top of the hierarchy. As I mentioned earlier, Florence was not the only city to have guilds, and nearly every civic and professional role was represented, except for one. Typically, in other cities, artists had a dedicated guild, the Guild of St. Luke, named for the patron saint of painters. The story of St. Luke is that he depicted the first painting of the Virgin and Child, and as such has become the protector of all painters and artists more broadly. In Florence, however, there was no dedicated Guild of St. Luke, and instead, artists were included in two different guilds. The painters belonged to the Guild of the Doctors and the Apothecaries, the Arti di Medici e Speziale. And that was because the painters purchased their pigments from the apothecaries. The sculptors were members of the Masters of Stone and Wood Guild. The guilds were key patron of the arts in Florence, and Orsan Michele would become the jewel in the crown of artistic patronage and rivalry in the commune. In addition to Orsan Michele, however, other architectural monuments, such as the baptistry, the Duomo, and the Ospedale delle Innocenti, were also sites of intense rivalry, competition, and artistic commission. But if we return to Orsan Michele for a moment, we can begin to unpack the highly competitive nature of the of the architecture, and in particular, the sculptures that encompass the entire circumference of the exterior. If you walk around the building, you cannot help but notice the myriad niches and elaborate sculptures found within, each one belonging to and having been commissioned by a particular guild. The sculptures that you see today, however, are not the originals. Those have been removed and placed indoors for conservation reasons. The statues in the niches are instead high-quality replicas intended to weather the sometimes unpredictable Florentine climate. Each guild wanted to have the most elaborate and expensive sculpture. Each guild wanted to have a commission by the most famous and important artist. And each guild wanted to outdo the other. Each guild wanted their niche to be the most pious. Because, as I said, although the guilds were secular by virtue of their worldly economic activities, Florence was still dominated by an undercurrent of religion, which ran deep within the private lives of most Florentines. If we begin with the Artists Guild, you'll remember that I said they did not have their own designated guild, but rather belonged to the Medici and the Speziale, the Doctors and Apothecaries Guild. Their statue is called the Madonna della Rosa, the Madonna of the Rose, attributed to Pietro di Giovanni Tedesco and created around the year 1399. It is one of the first niche statues that was made for Orsan Michele. The statue is about 2.2 meters tall and made of marble. We see the Christ child sitting atop Mary's lap, and both are seated on the throne of wisdom, a popular Christological motif. The child is trying to grab a bunch of roses held in Mary's right hand. Mary had long been considered the protector of Florence, not the patron saint, that would be St. John the Baptist. But as the protector, she would also have been the intercessor between Florence and her son. In traditional Catholic dogma, an individual, or in this case, an entire commune, could not directly engage with Christ. And so, as part of the cult of the Virgin, people would pray to her and ask her to plead to Jesus on their behalf. The fact that the Medici e Speziale got to have an enthroned Virgin and Child for their niche conveys their power and prestige within the city. The love and reverence for this statue and for what it represented was so great that there's a Latin inscription on the base below, which records an act of vandalism that occurred in 1493. The inscription also notes that the guilty party was sentenced to death. So the painters have done quite well for themselves with their Madonna and Child commission. But what about the sculptors? They were in a separate guild, that of the wood and stone workers. Here are a group of figures collectively referred to as the Quattro Santi Cornati, or four crowned martyrs or saints. This commission was granted to Nanni di Banco, a famous and important Florentine sculptor active in the early Quattrocento. Nanni di Banco was part of the first wave of Florentine artists working during the transition period from the International Gothic style to the Renaissance style that would come to dominate Florence and other Italian cities during the late 15th and early 16th centuries. He was a contemporary of Donatello and Lorenzo Ghiberti, both of whom I will get to shortly. Being granted the commission for Orsan Michele put Nanni di Banco on the artistic map, so to speak. And it is important to keep in mind that the competitive nature of Orsan Michele's commissions did not only concern the guilds, but also the artists. Landing a prestigious commission by a guild on a prominent Florentine monument could have important ramifications for an artist's career and reputation. And in a place like Florence, reputation was your brand. Word of mouth was how reputations were formed, for better or for worse. The commission for the Wood and Stone Workers Guild is considered to be one of the most sophisticated sculptures at Orsan Michele. It is especially notable for its high degree of naturalism and the individuality of each of the figures. The construction of the group was also very complex, and each statue was created separately and then placed together in a semicircular composition. The work represents a variation of what's called the Sacra Conversione, the sacred conversation, because the holy figures are engaged in a dialogue amongst themselves, unaware of observers and viewers. Additionally, this work clearly demonstrates the influence of Roman sculpture on Renaissance art. Commissioned in 1416, Nanni di Banco drew heavily from classical antiquity, with the garments, postures, and faces hearkening back to Roman Republican sculpture. The dialogue occurring is also intended to convey the importance of humanism in the Italian Renaissance intellectual culture. While some guilds chose to compete with the subject matter and figures chosen for their commissions, other guilds spared no expense securing a work by the leading artists of the time. Donatello was highly in demand during the Quattrocento, and no fewer than 3 guilds employed him to decorate their niches. Here we have a figure of Saint Mark as representative of the Linen Weavers and Peddlers Guild. Originally hired to contribute 3 pieces, the figure of Saint Mark is the first of Donatello's contribution to the commission. Standing an imposing 7 feet and 9 inches high, the figure of Saint Mark looms over spectators below. What truly sets Donatello's work apart from the other guild statues is the degree of naturalism evident in Saint Mark's body and face. Fine details, such as the veins in his hands, are clearly visible, and Donatello has set his figure in what is called contrapposto, or natural pose, because it mimics how the weight of a real human body rests and shifts. As you can see, Saint Mark's left leg is bent slightly to the front, and the majority of his body weight rests on his right leg, moves slightly to the back. This is an artistic technique borrowed straight from antiquity and revived during the Renaissance. The drapery of St. Mark's garments hang and bunches in realistic folds, the way a heavy garment naturally would want to fall against gravity. Even the pillow upon which he stands, despite being made of marble, looks like it would be plush to touch. The pillow and the emphasis on the garments are intended to stand as symbols for the linen guild, which act as visual signifiers that indicate which guild commissioned which work. The final statue from Orsanmichele that I want to discuss belongs to the Merchants Guild, who were right up in the top of the Arti Maggiore, and was created by Lorenzo Ghiberti. This statue is significant for several reasons. Firstly, it is a representation of St. John the Baptist, whom, as I mentioned earlier, is the patron saint of Florence. To have the patron saint of Florence as the visual representation of the guild would have been both religiously and culturally symbolic. Secondly, Ghiberti was one of the most famous and important artists, not just in Florence, but actively working in Italy during the Quattrocento. He became famous young because at only 21 years old, he won the competition for the doors of the baptistry, which quickly made him a household name. The statue for Orsanmichele was commissioned and produced between 1412 and 1416, so well into his career. Having him create the statue would have been a major public proclamation of the status of the Merchants Guild. Another reason why this statue is such a statement is because, unlike the other ones we've looked at tonight, and unlike many of the other ones at Orsanmichele, this statue is made of bronze, not marble, and it was cast entirely in one piece. This fact makes it the largest statue successfully cast in a single piece in Italy for several hundred years. And if anyone knows anything about casting, it's very labor intensive. There's lots of room for error. And so the fact that he was able to cast the entire thing in one piece is not only a technical, but also a feat of engineering. This would not have been an easy feat to accomplish in the medium of bronze. It was also the largest statue ever cast in Florence up until this point, and it demonstrates the high degree of naturalism in the garments, in the face, in the body that we see in the marble statues. All of this attests to the wealth and power of the Merchants Guild. Each guild used its resources, financial, social, and commercial, to commission the best artists, use the most expensive materials, and to have the most symbolic statue. While the commissioning of the statues for Orsanmichele was rooted in competition, it was not always friendly. Florence was rife with rivalry and envy, artists needing to get prominent commissions as a means to make a name for themselves. Landing a prestigious patron could mean a lifetime of secure and steady work, and could also potentially lead to gaining more high-profile commissions. The ideology of envy and slander are themes found not only in the visual arts, but also in literary works. Much like in the time of classical antiquity, during the Renaissance, a popular intellectual trope was the personification of ideas, concepts, themes, or feelings. The Calumny of Apelles, painted by Sandro Botticelli, is a panel painting of an allegory featuring 9 figures telling the story of Apelles, who was a renowned painter in ancient Greece. Much of what is known about Apelles comes from the writing of Pliny the Elder. The story of Apelles is that he was slandered by his rivals, and this became the subject of a now lost painting from antiquity that had a resurgence and became a popular subject during the Renaissance. Botticelli has created his own version of the story and included the personifications of vices and virtues, the king and Apelles, who was intended to stand in as an allegory for someone who had been the victim of slander more generally. Painted between 1494 and 1495, you can now see this panel here at the Uffizi in Florence. In order to decode this painting, we must read it left to right. We have Truth, who is nude and pointing towards the sky or heaven. Next to Truth is Repentance, dressed in black and looking over her shoulder up at Truth. Perfidy wears red and yellow and is meant as the personification of conspiracy. She stands over the body of the half-naked figure being dragged along the ground. This figure is Apelles, or anyone who's been the victim of slander and is now shaded by conspiracy. Calumny wears blue and white and drags the poor man by the hair, which again symbolizes that false claims can drag someone's good name through the mud. Fraud is standing behind Calumny and appears to be arranging her hair. Standing in front of the king is the figure of Envy, who uses his hand to obscure the king's view, as envy can often blind us to the truth because all we can see is what we desire. We have the king who has donkey ears, which is meant to be a reference to King Midas, who is destroyed by his own greed. On either side of the king stand the personifications of ignorance and suspicion, both of whom are grabbing the donkey ears and whispering into them. The true intention behind the work has never been confirmed. Botticelli may have simply been inspired by this popular ancient subject matter. However, there are some theories within the scholarly community that have speculated about the idea of whom the semi-naked figure was intended to be. Some scholars have suggested that Botticelli did have a specific slandered individual in mind when he made this work. Some people think it may have even been himself. Other theories have implied that Botticelli may have been making reference to Savonarola, the infamous Dominican friar and preacher from Ferrara, who terrorized Florence with his extreme views on piety and devotion during the mid-Quattrocento. About 10 years after Botticelli painted this work, he was the possible victim of calumny himself when in 1502, an anonymous denunciation was made to Florentine authorities accusing him of sodomy, an act that could easily have had you expelled or worse. The purpose of the painting has also been the source of much speculation. Ronald Lightbowen has suggested that Botticelli may have made it for his own private enjoyment, but Frederick Hart has raised the point that it may very well have been produced as a defense of Savonarola, especially as the figure of penitence is wearing a black cloak with a white garment underneath, the same robes and habit worn by the Dominican order to which Savonarola belonged. While Botticelli may have been fending off some anonymous attacks on his personal life, rivalries and competition between artists played out all over major cities, including Rome and Venice. Perhaps one of the greatest artistic feuds has to be between two Renaissance heavyweights, Michelangelo and Raphael. Raphael was the handsome, charming prodigy who was prolific, to say the least. When he died at only 37 on Good Friday, people took that as a sign of divine sanctification of his talents. Prior to his death, he had produced some of the most famous and well-executed masterpieces of the Renaissance, and had worked for the best patrons, including Pope Julius II. Together with Michelangelo and Leonardo, he forms the trinity of Renaissance painters, a pinnacle in the cult of the superstar artist. Michelangelo, on the other hand, was less agreeable than Raphael. Often described as difficult and moody, he was much older than Raphael and lacked the movie star good looks of his younger rival. But in the realm of talent, he was a heavy hitter, and much like Raphael, was hired by the wealthiest and most powerful patrons, also including Pope Julius II. When Raphael died, the entirety of Rome was said to have been plunged into mourning, much like what we have recently experienced with the death of the much-loved Queen Elizabeth II on September 8th of this year. Raphael was given a lavish funeral attended by massive crowds, and he was laid to rest in the Pantheon. But Michelangelo was not interested in paying his respects, and in fact, he did quite the opposite. A few years later, he wrote a scathing letter accusing Raphael of plagiarism and stating that everything Raphael knew of art, he had learned from him, Michelangelo. The roots of this bitter rivalry may have been both one-sided and clearly post-mortem. The roots can be found in the work that both of these artists did for Pope Leo X at the Vatican. Many people are familiar with the Sistine Chapel ceiling, even if only from pop cultural references. Similarly, Raphael painted the magnificent walls in the Vatican stanza, and every tour of the Vatican includes both masterpieces. According to some sources, Michelangelo resented Raphael's easy entry into Roman artistic and aristocratic circles. Apparently, while Michelangelo was toiling away on the ceiling, this plucky young upstart rolled into Rome and became the hot new kid in town. Raphael was instantly likable for both his artistic genius and his amenable demeanor. Michelangelo was apparently especially annoyed that upon Raphael's arrival in Rome, he received adulation for his work on the papal apartments, which, according to Michelangelo, showed influences that he had passed on to him, that he had drawn from Michelangelo's work. And it was rumored that despite his brilliance, Michelangelo's unfriendly demeanor made it also difficult for him to be his patron's favorite client, while Raphael's charm, in addition to his incredible creativity, made him dear to Pope Leo X. Michelangelo also felt as though Raphael had made him the butt of a visual joke when he included Michelangelo in one of the frescoes in the stanza della Segnatura. Here we see the brooding, pensive figure, which scholars have posited is intended to be a representation of the ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus, who apparently was nicknamed the Obscure and the Weeping Philosopher. And then there was the unfortunate incident involving an ambassador who mistakenly stated that the Sistine ceiling had been painted by Raphael. But Raphael was not Michelangelo's only rival. He had his fingers in many proverbial competitive pies. He also apparently deeply resented Da Vinci. The legendary artist and biographer Giorgio Vasari recalled the tension that grew between Michelangelo and Da Vinci when they were working on a commission for the Palazzo Vecchio, again here in Florence. The relationship apparently became so acrimonious that, according to Vasari, Da Vinci gave up the commission and fled Florence for France just to get away from Michelangelo. Now, I must also add the caveat that although Vasari's Lives is a canonical text still used in art historical discourse today, it must be taken with a slight grain of salt and not as gospel. I will say, though, that given the textual sources we have, we can confirm that Michelangelo's personality, heated arguments, and disagreements with other artists, especially contemporaries of equal creative measure, were a common occurrence. Michelangelo's attitude towards life was very different than that of Da Vinci's and Raphael's. Michelangelo was a devout Catholic and lived a very austere lifestyle, tempered by restraint and extreme self-denial. He was alleged to have lived a, quote, Spartan existence, sleeping in his clothes and boots and eating very little and only out of necessity, never pleasure. Compared with Raphael, who was considered a Casanova, regularly engaging in the pleasures of the flesh, Michelangelo was rumored to have been a closeted homosexual who struggled with his sexual identity. Yet despite his deep personal unhappiness, Michelangelo has given the world some of the greatest works of art. And in an odd way, perhaps his obsessive competition with other artists is what fueled this incredible internal creative force. But competition and rivalry did not exist only between individual artists or city-states during the Renaissance. Anyone who has studied Italian Renaissance art or Italian Renaissance history, even only in passing, is likely to have come across the long-standing debate referred to as the paragone. The word literally translates from Italian into English as competition. The clue is in the title, people, because that is exactly what it was. It was competition between the media of painting and sculpture. And within painting, between the concepts of colore and disegno, all of which I will unpack now. Beginning with the intellectual sparring of painting versus sculpture, the paragone was a debate where humanists and artists argued the merits of each media in an attempt to draw an affirmative conclusion about which one was the superior art form. The origins of the paragone can be traced back to the 15th century with the publication of Da Vinci's Treatise on Painting. In this work, Da Vinci extols the virtues of painting, observing its challenges and the dominance of sight amongst all the senses. This invited criticism and feedback from other intellectuals and artists, each weighing in on the conversation with their opinions about painting and where sculpture stood in the mix. Some of the virtues of paintings included its ability to render the most minute details with painstaking accuracy. Painting in oil allowed for more experimentation. For example, if an artist did not like something or made an error, it could be more easily remedied, as oil paint was a particularly forgiving material. Painting could also allow artists to manipulate time by allowing them to show the same scene or narrative at different points in the temporal or historical narrative. The merits of painting were first written about in depth by Leon Battista Alberti in 1435. Alberti likened painting to looking out of a window in that you can see the entire scene, and he argued the painting was a greater intellectual exercise than sculpture because a painter had to consider many more factors, such as depth, space, color, and proportion. Arguments in favor of sculpture included the medium's three-dimensional quality, thereby rendering it more lifelike by virtue of its physical manifestation alone. Another point connected with this three-dimensional aspect was that people could experience sculptures in the round. Viewers could experience a sculpture from multiple different angles and sides, and even walk around an object, getting a complete 360-degree view. Even within the technique of painting, as I just mentioned, there existed a paragone. For painters debated amongst themselves whether colore or disegno was a superior feature of painting. Colore, which translates as color, refers to the use of paint to create colors and pigments that would enhance the realism of the subject being depicted. How a painter was able to use color to create the illusion of reality was at the heart of painting. and of its merits. Disegno, which translates as design, was focused more on the linear composition of a work, how forms were rendered, often using pencil or chalk to create the illusion of reality. And just like the competition between painting and sculpture, battle lines were drawn and sides were taken. For colore, the city of Venice was the geographical backdrop of this technique. Having long been associated with water for obvious reasons, during the Renaissance, Venice became synonymous not only with water, but also with light. More specifically, how light and water impacted an artist's ability to interpret and use color in painting. This became especially important when artists began using the novel medium of oil paint on canvas. Oil allowed for a greater degree of experimentation with color because now artists could mix pigments with ease and a larger variety of tone. Being in Venice and seeing the light of the sun and the moon reflecting off of the canals would give these painters a new way of experiencing color, a new dimension for understanding its versatility. But oil painting was also popular in Venice because of Venice's climate. As I'm sure many of you know, Venice has a rather damp air about it, and this humidity was not conducive to working with frescoes, which is plaster and pigment pasted onto the walls of buildings. Frescoes are best suited for much drier environments, and sadly, not many original frescoes still survive in Venice from the Quattrocento. These two reasons played a large role in the rise of oil painting and its use within the so-called Venetian school. But we cannot talk about colore without talking about the key painters who were the great advocates of this technique. Titian, as he is called in English, is one of the best-known Renaissance painters in history. Born Tiziano Vicelli in the Republic of Venice, sometime between 1488 and 1490, he is considered the most important member of the 16th century Venetian school. Along with Giorgione, he is also considered to be the founder of the Venetian school of Italian Renaissance painting, which prized things like colore as a focal point of the art. Some of his best-known works include Sacred and Profane Love, Danae, and his Venus and the Musician series, which features the figure of Venus naked with a variety of musicians playing to her. All of Titian's works emphasize the importance of color as a means of conveying realism. If we look at this version of the Venus and Musician, we see a lute player and we see Cupid, and we can see how Titian has used color to add depth and texture to the work. The velvet upon which Venus lays has the folds and creases naturally found when this fabric is draped over a surface. Titian has used color to play with light and shadow to give the illusion of the folds in the fabric. Another great master of the use of colore is Tintoretto, a name that translates as little dyer because his family was in the fabric and cloth dyeing industry. Born Jacopo Robusti in Venice in 1518, Tintoretto, as he came to be known, was also associated with the Venetian school and used color to express depth and realism in his works. His works were produced using a boldness of brushstrokes and had an energy that earned him the nickname Il Furioso, the Furious. He also created work with incredible speed, a quality that was both admired and criticized by his contemporaries. In this work, entitled Christ at the Sea of Galilee, and produced in the later part of the 16th century, it is easy to see how color has been manipulated to create a particular visual experience in the water, in the waves, in the sky, even in the craggy rocks. The oddness of the composition and the figures is due to the fact that Tintoretto also painted in the Mannerist style, which was known for its unique way of rendering the human form, specifically the proportions. And of course, it would be remiss of me not to mention the importance of the Bellini dynasty and workshop in the colore debate. The Bellini family have often been given credit with creating the earliest Renaissance art in Venice, and their workshop had a real monopoly on the painting scene. Jacopo Bellini was the head of the family, and his two sons, Gentile and Giovanni, were also painters, as was his son-in-law, Andrea Mantegna. Extremely famous and in demand, this family is considered to be the main proponent of the Renaissance in Venice, and has influenced generations of painters after them. Much like Titian and Tintoretto, their innovative use of color was inspired by the light and the water of their surrounding environment. Because Venice had also been a Byzantine city at one point, the presence of gold and mosaics in places such as San Marco also contributed to how color and light were perceived by the eye. Hence, colore had found a championing setting in which to evolve. Much further south, however, in Rome, the other side of the Paragone was flourishing. Disegno was in full use by artists such as Da Vinci and Michelangelo. Many of Michelangelo's sketches engage with disegno as a means of rendering the realities of the human body. These sketches were often studies done for practice and also as cartoons for larger works that at first had to be clarified in miniature. This image is part of his studies for the Sistine ceiling, in particular a figure called the Libyan Sibyl. Looking closely at this sketch, we can see the finest details of the muscles, the skin, the ribs, the hair, the face. This was one of the arguments in favor of disegno over colore, that the use of pencil could render details with unparalleled accuracy, especially when line and form were the focus. The goal was to achieve a clarity of line and form, not to be distracted by color. In this work by Raphael, called Palacolonna, while the colors are vibrant jewel tones, they are secondary to the design and composition. Disegno is most clearly evident in the crisp, undulating lines of the draperies and the columns and the stark shadows on the steps of the throne where the Virgin and Child are seated. Despite arguments both for and against colore versus disegno, it would be difficult to say that one medium is better than the other, as both clearly have their artistic merits and limitations. While competition, rivalry, and envy were inborn parts of the Renaissance, so too was outright violence and crime. Caravaggio, although a brilliant artist, was also a dangerous and violent man who had multiple issues with the law. The incident in the restaurant at the start of this lecture gives you a slight glimpse into his character. He was highly sensitive to verbal assaults or interactions that he perceived to be verbal assaults. While I told you that Caravaggio smashed the plate over the waiter's face, I neglected to mention that it was a plate of artichokes, some cooked in butter and some in oil. When the waiter suggested that Caravaggio simply needed to smell them to determine which ones were cooked in butter, the violent interaction kicked off, and the waiter ended up in hospital, having been cut by the shards of broken plate. The waiter launched a lawsuit against Caravaggio, and the records of the court case can be found today in the state archives in Rome. But Caravaggio was protected by some of his high-ranking patrons, who made the lawsuit, and presumably the waiter, go away. His friends in powerful places, however, could only help so much. On May 29th, 1606, Caravaggio got into a disagreement with a man called Ranuccio Tomassoni, and a physical fight ensued, which resulted in Tomassoni being stabbed and bleeding to death. As a result, a warrant was issued for Caravaggio's arrest for the murder. He was condemned as an outlaw by Pope Paul V Borghese, who issued a death warrant in addition to the arrest warrant. Caravaggio chose to flee Rome and go on the lam, as the phrase goes. He remained a fugitive for the final few years of his life, constantly anxious that the law would catch up with him. There is speculation that in an attempt to procure a pardon for himself and his crime, Caravaggio painted this work of David with the head of Goliath for the nephew of the Pope, who was an art collector and also a cardinal. As a cardinal, he would have had the authority to grant the pardon, but Caravaggio never received one, nor did he ever live again as a free man. It is believed that he died on the 18th of July, 1610, aged 38, near Grosseto in Tuscany. While Caravaggio is probably not the only Renaissance artist to have struggles with violence or personal demons, he is probably the most well-known. Despite his brilliance, his personal struggles and destructive lifestyle have become annexes to his history. It is difficult to think of him without immediately also thinking of the darkness that colored his personal narrative and professional activities. I've taken you on this sojourn into the darker side of the Renaissance, not to disabuse you from any preconceived notions about the grandeur of this period, but rather to reinforce just how marvelous it actually was. That despite the rivalry and envy and violence, it was a time in which some of the greatest artworks were created. And I am willing to wager that it's partly because of the competition, not in spite of it, that this high degree of creativity was possible. You see, General George S. Patton was correct when he said the pressure makes diamonds, because this was a period in which great artists were under immense pressure, the pressure of securing work, of finding an important patron and wealthy clients, and for becoming known. While the production of art during the Renaissance was a labor of love, it was also a means to an end for many artists, because it was how they made their living, and perhaps how they kept the darkness at bay. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very wide-ranging and stimulating talk. Now, if you can, there we are. I don't know if people on the Zoom or people in the room would like to ask questions. Any questions, please?
What's known about how the business of securing the contracts was executed? Did the artists tend to have to do it themselves, or did they have agency? And which of those people then would find it useful to sort of create the promotable aspect of the individual?
Thank you. That's a very good question. And it speaks to the trajectory of what we know about artists. So if we go back a few centuries into the medieval period, we have lots of medieval art, but we don't know who made any of it, because that was never the purpose of it. It was a crucifix needed to be made, an altarpiece needed to be made. But as you start moving through the medieval period and into the Renaissance, certainly in the 15th and 16th century, you get what I referred to as the cult of the superstar artist. Now, that's not my term. That's sort of a kind of colloquial slang term for what we're seeing, the Michelangelos, the Da Vinci's, the Raphaels. So you're starting to have household names, you're starting to have workshops. So yes, it would make sense that they would have these representatives. But what's interesting is oftentimes they did not. So they had to be scrappy in a way. And that's why I kept trying to emphasize in the talk how the idea of reputation was so key. And, having the artistic goods to back up a difficult personality certainly helped. I mean, Michelangelo was apparently brutal to work with. Yeah. And there's this anecdote about when he was working on the Sistine ceiling, he was just driving everyone crazy. And someone went to the Pope, one of the administrators, and said, he's impossible. And the Pope said, I don't care. He's a genius. He can do whatever he wants. And in fact, I think they were sort of said he uses too many expletives, and which I think was probably one of the more benign features of his personality. But all of that is to say, the commissions almost functioned as agents. So in a lot of ways, you would see these brilliant works. And it also speaks to dynamics in workshops. So for example, as an artist's reputation grew and they started building these workshops, sometimes they had so many commissions on the go that perhaps all they were able to do was the face or something significant. And then assistants would work on, depending on where you are, say, so obviously if the Pope asks you to paint something, you dedicate the time, you make the whole thing. But if maybe a lesser prince or duke wants something, okay, I'll do the face and then get my assistant to do the rest. But so it's reputation, it's word of mouth. But to the first part of your question about what we know, there's a surprising amount of records and documents, again, held in state archives, which it's all right there. As I said, the court case. So it's really interesting to go back and read. I mean, a lot of the stuff they were grappling with is stuff that, human beings haven't evolved that much. They grapple with legal issues, they grapple with personality disorders, they grapple with, but no, they didn't sort of have these kind of agents working on their behalf. It was a combination of your name was known, your work was coveted, and then word of mouth. And for Raphael, it seemed very almost effortless. Everybody wanted a piece of him, and Michelangelo's sitting there feeling resentful, and it almost became a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way. I laughed when I learned about the anecdote where the ambassador said, "Oh, the wonderful Sistine Chapel painted by Raphael. That's Michelangelo's greatest nightmare come alive." So in a lot of ways, they had to advocate for themselves, which is why the pressure to produce and to consistently produce good work. So somebody like Caravaggio, who's kind of constantly marred by personal and legal woes, but his work is also, extraordinary. So I hope that answers the question in a kind of not so convoluted way. Oftentimes, yes, they would. So they would negotiate directly with their patron. That's also where there was a deep personal relationship. And again, somebody like Raphael, who was very likable, very amenable, and was considered very dear to Pope Leo X, he got on personally. And so a lot of times they did have to negotiate. But again, also, the more famous you are, the more you can ask for. And acquisitions will be, or allowances will be made. Again, he's brilliant, he can do whatever he wants kind of attitude. But yes, there were no sort of agents or reps, especially the way we understand the entertainment industry or the art world today.
Have they ever come to blows amongst each other, the artists?
Oh, yes. There was one anecdote, which I didn't include, but it involved a large scale commission, not in the Vatican, but in a palazzo, I believe here in Florence. And there were several different artists working on this commission, and they were high up on the scaffolding. And one of the artists somehow fell off of the scaffolding. And suddenly, oh my, this whole commission is mine. Well, isn't that unfortunate? But I'll just have to soldier on. So yes, there absolutely was this sort of professional rivalry. Again, Raphael dies and the whole world plunges into mourning, and Michelangelo takes this as his opportunity to write his, essentially his entry in the burn book, as it were, sort of taking a page from Dante to really kind of, sort of critique him. So they came to both literal blows, metaphorical blows. But yeah, that's a particularly funny anecdote. I say funny because, it's comical, but not so much for the person who ended up at the bottom of the scaffolding. So.
Simon here. I'm just going to intervene from the ether. You can probably see me on the big screen at the back. I'm not very far away. I'm still in Perda because I contracted COVID in London last week, which is very annoying. I hope to be back very soon, hopefully even tomorrow. Couple of things. First, just a housekeeping note. Stephanie or Mark, can you make sure that people asking questions in the room use the microphone? Because us here on the Zoom can't hear the questions.
They can't hear the questions on the Zoom.
Second of all, I just wanted to thank you very much, Stephanie. Nice to meet you virtually.
Oh, nice to meet you, Simon.
We've never actually managed to make it in the flesh yet, but we'll have to
today's the day.
That soon. But thanks very much for coming by and giving us such a fabulous lecture. Third thing I'll do is my usual reminder to the Zoomers and Sarah, who's also got COVID diagnosis, but isn't fortunately not too many symptoms, but she's also working from home. She'll put up the link for those on the Zoom who'd like to make a donation as your whatever level you're happy with for this lecture. Those in the room having already paid the entrance fee. And end of my various notices, I would just ask you a little question. You were talking about the rivalry, the conflict between Disegno and Colore.
Yes.
And you illustrated very well with the Roman and the Venetian schools. But what I didn't fully understand is how that rivalry was actually played out in terms of a public debate, or indeed in terms of who was getting commissions and who wasn't as a result.
That's a good question. So the way I approached the debate tonight about Colore and Disegno, sorry, you said Colore and Disegno, or between sculpture and painting, Simon?
I said Colore and Disegno, but I'd be equally interested in painters and sculptors.
Sure, yes.
Sculptures.
Yes. So again, it would have been playing out in many of the ways in a lot of the works I talked about today. So for example, Michelangelo, even though artists never really took a definitive side one way or another, you sort of saw where their leanings were. So we have quite a few sketches by Michelangelo, and he was fixated with the anatomical correctness of figures. And for him, he felt like the best way to accurately render the human body was to use pencil, was to use red chalk. And so I think the way we see it playing out, I mean, it was a debate within humanist circles where it would have been more conversation style. But as for playing out with patrons, ultimately everything always boils down to what somebody wants to pay for and someone's personal taste. And so some patrons wanted the lavish oil painting with the rich color, and someone like Titian would have been in high demand. Or for example, when I talked about the sketch of the Libyan Sibyl, the sketch was done as a study because it had to be done in miniature and then painted onto the wall of the Sistine Chapel. So in a lot of ways, it boils down to, there's a lot going on. The humanists are talking about it, but they're not doing anything really. The patrons are picking sides with their commissions in terms of what they like and what they want to purchase, and it ebbed and flowed. So sometimes a certain Disegno was more in style, but each as I said has its merits and its limitations. So for example, sculpture, you walk around it and get a 360-degree view, whereas painting, you could render a narrative of a battle scene in different moments in time, which allowed for the manipulation of time. And a lot of painters saw value in that as an intellectual exercise. So it's a good question. And again, I think we'd have to really probe it, we'd have to go back to the textual sources rooted in the humanist conversations, because artists weren't writing it down. They were acting, they were doing, whereas the humanists were writing a lot, thinking a lot, recording a lot. Does that kind of make sense?
Sure, it does. Before you go back to the room, I see Mr. Moore McCann has been patiently waiting. Sir, speak first.
Thank you. I'm glad you've got the right gender this time. I'm the one with the beard, okay? Thank you very much. That was really interesting. I'm not an art historian. I'm a medical doctor, so I know nothing really. But I've always been fascinated by imagery or iconography of the Virgin Mary. She always looks like a middle-class Western lady.
She always looks, I'm sorry.
I presume she was a swarthy Palestinian. So when did that happen and why?
I'm sorry that I could not quite hear the question. The Virgin always looks
like a middle-class Western European.
Oh, yes.
In fact, she was probably a swarthy Palestinian. Well, why did that happen?
Well, so this is a really interesting question, because it speaks to a dialogue happening right now in art history, the idea of representation and the representation of figures. And again, it's a lot of it is geography, a lot of it is regional. So for example, if you look at virgins produced in the Netherlands, they always tend to be very white, blonde, red-haired, bulbous forehead. Whereas, but what's really fascinating, equally fascinating, is we have these incredible Ethiopian manuscripts in which the virgin is depicted with much darker skin tones. So, and I'm not an expert on that at all. Interestingly, my project at the Kunsthistorische Institute, I came interested in elite patronage, and now I'm completely obsessed with this idea of how people from different parts of the world have been represented in Venetian manuscripts. So I'm reading a lot about how people from places like Byzantium, Asia, North Africa were represented visually, because I think when we look at the representations, it can start to tell us things about how people from other parts of the world are internalized and conceived of and perceived. So, and again, a lot of it is, rooted in colonialism, the dominant hegemonic force in a culture imposing its image, man made in the image of God, God made in the image of man. But you hit on a very, very relevant and timely topic that's really fascinating and coming to the fore of art history. And we're rethinking and reexamining representations, because in Venice, for example, Venice and Florence, these were hubs of international activity, trade, pilgrims. It's not that, you're in some isolated tiny place on the other side of the ozone layer and you only know your little clan, so when you see people from other parts of the world being depicted in certain ways, it's imperative we start asking these questions. What is this telling us about how people were interpreted, received? So it's an incredibly rich question. And I myself am just beginning to scratch the surface and have these conversations. But again, it goes to that historical idea of what did Jesus look like? If Jesus, as a person, as a human being who existed from that region on the planet, what do we expect someone from that part of the world to look like? So it's very complex. It's all tied into, as I said, colonialism, political hegemony, history. It's a really, really rich topic. And I am, again, by no means an expert, but just scathing or scratching the surface of it. But it's an excellent question.
Thank you
And again,
very
with the marble, we don't know. Some of these statues may have been painted, in fact.
much.
We think they may have been painted. And that's another really interesting facet of sculpture, is we're used to seeing those kinds of white classical sculptures, but it's commonly believed now that these would have been painted, these sculptures from classical antiquity, which brings a whole new view to it all. So
Okay, thank you very much. So
you
watch
for
the
your question.
space, huh?
Dr. Brendan, Dr. Moore
Any
McCann will be,
questions from the room?
will maybe pleased to know that next month we've got the return of our friend Dr. Duncan Geddes, who last year did a award round on the health status of the various depictions of the baby Jesus. This year he's coming back to look at, with a medical eye, at what on earth was happening to the martyrs.
Brilliant. Thank you, Simon. I hope you get better soon.
Thank you. I'll shut up now and let you go back to the room.
Any more questions from the room? No? Yes.
Did Filippo Lippi, after abducting a nun and associating with low-life people in Florence, escape censor from other artists? Did Filippo Lippi, who abducted a nun and associated with low-life people in Florence, did he get censor from other artists? Censor.
Yes. I suppose in modern parlance, we would say cancel culture, canceled. It's interesting. I don't know much about him as an artist, but it's an interesting question, because tonight I focused on mostly how these artists were chastised or exiled or sanctioned by authority figures. But that's a really interesting point of entry, the inner dynamics of artistic circles, whether or not an artist would have been considered to have kind of traversed or transgressed social norms within artistic circles. That's a really interesting question. I don't know specifically about Lippi, but yeah, no, I'm just having a think, because as I said, the idea of, I mean, I often think about, Michelangelo spinning his wheels, writing these, critiques of Raphael. And I don't know that Raphael gave much of a toss, really. He was just carrying on and doing his thing. And, but again, it would be very interesting to see what the inner dynamics were within workshops, within artistic circles, within friendship groups, outside of authority and law. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much indeed again.
Could I just,
Thank you for those who took part via Zoom, and for those who are in the room here with us, please come next door and enjoy the wine provided by Tenuto degli Dei.